In this unit, we have been reflecting on some of the moral issues that emerge related to end-of-life care. We began looking at the work of Atul Gawande, raising the question as to whether some of what we do at the end of life to preserve life and extend life, whether it actually ends up doing more harm than good to patients. We have considered the basis of a patient's right to refuse care, and some of the reasons why it may be perfectly morally permissible to refuse or to withhold or withdraw or not recommend for life-sustaining treatment. And then we turned to the arguments related to whether, beyond removing care, it might also be appropriate sometimes to actually put a patient to death. Now we want to turn a bit to how these matters look from the perspective of various religious traditions, and how people's religious and spiritual values affect the way they make decisions about end-of-life care. I want to begin our reflections on these matters saying a word about what we are talking about when we talk about religion and spirituality. When we talk about religion or people's religious beliefs, values, and perspectives, we are talking about the ways in which people are shaped by organized, institutionalized, and more or less formal systems of belief and practice. Many people identify with particular religious traditions. We think of ourselves as Christians, as Jews, as Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Wiccans, etc. And thinking of ourselves that way suggests that the beliefs and practices associated with those religious systems are important influences in our lives. Of course, people's religious identification goes beyond or more deeply than these very broad categories, and might also involve more specific categories within a larger tradition. So, for example, Christians often identify as either Protestant or Catholic, and among Protestants, even some think of themselves as Baptist or Methodist or Presbyterian or Lutheran, or maybe non-denominational or independent. And even more concretely than this, people are shaped profoundly by the particular local community with which they affiliate. So it's not just that a person is a Sunni Muslim or an Orthodox Jew or a Southern Baptist Christian. He or she typically participates in the life of a particular mosque, synagogue, or congregation, and is shaped by what we might call local understandings and practices of these broader religious traditions. It should also be pointed out that people vary both in their level of participation in those communities and traditions, and in the significance they attach to their religious orientation in relation to other non-religious factors that shape our lives. Put differently, people are not simply religious or not. They are also more or less religious. Spirituality is a bit more difficult to define or describe. Dalaman and Vanderkreek note that, quote, spirituality may or may not be linked to religious practices or communities that support those practices and beliefs. They don't clearly define what they're talking about or what they mean by spirituality. Alan Astro and his colleagues may be more helpful. In their article, Religion, Spirituality, and Healthcare, they say that spirituality is the name given to a person or a group's relationship with the transcendent, however that may be construed. Spirituality is about the search for transcendent meaning, unquote. Transcendent is, of course, the difficult word here. The Merriam-Webster dictionary says that transcendent refers to something that exceeds usual limits, particularly the limits of ordinary experience or the limits of the universe or of material existence. So in defining spirituality as people's relationship to the transcendent and their search for transcendent meaning, Astro and colleagues are suggesting that we often have a sense that there is something more than the ordinary, something more than the material, and that somehow we can have a relationship to that something more which is beyond all that the human senses and the human sciences enable us to understand. Not only can we have a relationship to something transcendent, that relationship can be a source of meaning in our lives. We look for transcendent meaning. Now, there are many things that give our lives meaning. Our friendships, our jobs, the other activities in which we invest so much of our time and energy, money and wealth, status and power, excellence in any endeavor can all be sources of meaning. But evidently, we human beings also have a sense that there's something more, something beyond all this, that can be a source of meaning in our lives. Spirituality, according to Astro and his colleagues, refers to our search for a relationship with and meaning in that something transcendent. Astro and his colleagues say rightly that, quote, spirituality is a broader term than religion, though they note that most people express their spirituality in religious practice, unquote. They go on to note, however, that others express their spirituality in their relationship to nature, music, the arts, a set of philosophical beliefs, or simply relationships with friends and family. Put simply, then, being religious is one way of being spiritual or attending to spiritual matters, but one can be deeply spiritual without being religious, that is, without adhering to the beliefs and practices of any organized, formal religion. There are multiple ways that spirituality is relevant to healthcare. First, it is important to recognize that a person's religious or spiritual orientation can have a significant impact on how patients experience illness and the pain and suffering that accompany it. This is especially true with life-threatening illness. We have noted that spirituality has to do with our search for meaning. And we've noted that we find meaning in a variety of places, in our friendships and other relationships, in the work that we do, in the activities in which we invest so much of our time and energy, in our relationship to something transcendent like God. An experience of serious illness, especially life-threatening illness, challenges all those sources of meaning. It creates challenges in our relationships. It makes it more difficult to do our work or engage energetically in those activities that give our lives meaning and purpose. All that means is that illness is a source of existential or spiritual crisis, especially life-threatening illness. It's an essential component of what we experience when we experience illness. And surely we call upon our religious and spiritual values and the communities that support those values in us. We call upon them to enable us to address this spiritual crisis, to enable us to find meaning again in the midst of grave illness. Dalleman and Van de Kreek point to another important connection between religion, spirituality, and healthcare. They note ample evidence that religion and spirituality actually enhance people's subjective well-being, that is, our experience of the quality of our lives in the midst of illness. They point to 4 ways that religion and spirituality make this contribution. People's religious values may promote what they call a salubrious or healthy lifestyle. Religious people may tend to live more healthily and therefore be more healthy. As well, religion and spirituality provide systems of meaning and existential coherence. We've talked about that. They establish a personal relationship with the divine other, and they ensure social support and integration within a community. Note particularly that element of social support, typically provided by participation in a religious community. Many have noted that participation creates a sense of overall well-being in us that those without that participation sometimes lack. Finally, and this is most relevant to our concerns in this unit, religious traditions and spiritual values, according to Dalleman and Van de Kreek, provide an ethical foundation for decision-making. It is this latter, as I've said, about which we are most concerned here. Conclude this initial presentation by saying a bit about the reading material I have assigned to you on the course website. I've made reference already to an essay by Dalaman and Vandekriek and another by Astro and his colleagues. Both are available to you on Canvas, but only the one by Astro is required. Also, pay close attention and review the teachings of the major world religious traditions in these two essays. The first by Bulow and his colleagues, The World's Major Religious Points of View on End-of-Life Decisions in the Intensive Care Unit, and an article by the Pew Center called Religious Groups' Views of End-of-Life Issues. The first essay is a great place to start for a general review of the world's religious traditions, but it doesn't pay a great deal of attention to various Protestant Christian perspectives. The Pew essay does talk about various such groups, such as the Assemblies of God, Baptist, Episcopalian, Lutheran, United Church of Christ, and Methodist. There is also an essay assigned for your study by Cohen called When the Doctor is Not God. It tells 3 stories about end-of-life healthcare decisions that were affected by religious beliefs. Pay particular attention to the first 2. Besides these 2 essays, you will also find in the folder under Files entitled Religion, Spirituality, and EOL several subfolders related to Protestantism, Judaism, and the religions of the East, Buddhism and Hinduism in particular. These are brief materials for you to look at to deepen your knowledge. The last assigned reading is the 5th chapter from a book called Cancer is Funny by Jason Michelli. It's part of his memoir about how this young United Methodist pastor struggled with a stage serious cancer diagnosis. I hope you'll enjoy reading that, and your enjoyment will be enhanced by the fact that you'll have the opportunity to meet him on October 25th when he is here to make a public presentation about this memoir. Well, hopefully this has been a useful introduction to the matters we will consider in this week. In my next presentation, I'll summarize the teachings of the world's great religious traditions as it relates to end-of-life care. That'll be in the next presentation.